Are continuing to follow developing news after a young woman's body was found outside Scioto Grove Metro Park.
On a cold February night in Columbus, a bright, promising young woman vanished without a trace. What unfolded next would expose a predator lurking in plain sight and a justice system riddled with fatal flaws. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. It was a cold, clear night in Columbus, Ohio on the 8th of February 2017. Reagan Tokes had just finished her shift at Bodega, a trendy spot in the city's bustling Short North district. Known for its lively atmosphere and eclectic menu, the bar was a favourite among students and young professionals too. Reagan, a psychology senior at the Ohio State University, had been working there for months, earning a reputation as the friendly and dependable server who always greeted patrons with a warm smile. That night, she joked with co-workers, served regulars, and planned her upcoming weekend. Just another shift in the life of a 21-year-old balancing the responsibilities of work and school. As her shift ended, Reagan bundled up against the February chill. She wore her favourite winter coat, one she brought back from her hometown in Ohio. The air was sharp and biting as she stepped onto the high street, the hub of Columbus nightlife, alive with the glow of neon signs and the murmur of late-night diners. The familiar hum of the city wrapped her up as she made her way to her car, parked just a short distance away. It was routine, something she'd done countless times before. Reagan's world was full of promise. Friends described her as the kind of person who would light up a room, a natural extrovert who loved connecting with others. Her Instagram was filled with snapshots of her life, smiling with friends at Ohio State football games, sharing inside jokes with her younger sister Mackenzie, and spending time with her close-knit family. Her parents, Lisa and Toby, often referred to her as their sunshine because of her optimistic outlook and boundless energy. At Ohio State, Reagan excelled academically and socially. Her interest in psychology stemmed from her deep empathy for others. She wanted to make a difference in people's lives, perhaps working in therapy or counselling. She balanced her studies with a love for adventure, whether it was exploring new restaurants in Columbus or taking spontaneous trips with her friends. Just the weekend before, she'd gone out to dinner at one of her favourite spots, North Star Cafe, sharing laughs over their famous veggie burgers and sweet potato fries. Her friendships were genuine and unbreakable. She was the one who always made sure everyone felt included. The friend you could call in the middle of the night, she would always be there to talk to you. But Reagan's life wasn't all about fun. She worked hard, often picking up extra shifts at Bodega to save for post-graduation plans. She had dreams of travelling, maybe to Europe, and eventually she wanted to settle into a career where she could help people. She was grounded, kind, and resilient, the type of young woman who seemed destined to leave a mark on the world. Yet, as she walked to her car that night, her thoughts likely on her future, she couldn't have known that someone was watching her from the shadows. By the next morning, the world that had seemed so bright and full of promise for Reagan was plunged into darkness. When she didn't come home that night, her roommates began to worry pretty much immediately. It just wasn't like Reagan to disappear without a word. She was responsible, someone who always kept in touch. Her friends decided to call her phone, but they became even more worried when it went straight to voicemail, and the text that they'd sent her went completely unanswered. By mid-morning, Reagan's absence was no longer just a concern, it was a crisis. Her family and friends mobilised quickly, filing a missing persons report with the Columbus police, and then just waiting. Investigators took this very seriously. They began piecing together Reagan's movements from the previous night. Now, co-workers at Bodega confirmed that Reagan had left at around 9:45 p.m. She was cheerful and seemingly without a care in the world. It didn't seem like anything was wrong. She hadn't mentioned that she had any plans, and so as far as they were concerned, she had planned to just head straight home. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses was collected, and it showed her walking towards her car, which was parked just a few blocks away. But then, the trail went cold. The first break in the case came later that day when Reagan's car was found. It had been abandoned at an apartment complex miles from where she had parked it. The vehicle, a silver Acura, was locked and her purse and phone were missing. Forensic teams swept the car for evidence and they uncovered signs of a struggle. They were just small, subtle clues, but they hinted at the terror Regan must have endured. In Regan's car, forensic investigators discovered several pieces of key evidence that suggested this struggle. There was a cigarette butt with DNA, and as far as Regan's friends and family knew, she didn't smoke. This was collected and taken for DNA testing. On top of this, there was just the general dishevelled interior. It showed signs of a struggle. And there were handprints and other trace evidence. Investigators found smudged fingerprints and handprints that appeared consistent with efforts to resist or defend oneself. Finally, inside the car they also found some jewellery that was untouched. This supported the theory that this was an abduction and not just some kind of robbery. By the time dusk fell on the 9th of February, a horrifying discovery confirmed everyone's worst fears. Regan's body was found in a nearby metro park. It was 15 miles south of the city. The scene at the park was haunting. Regan's body lay partially covered by snow, her clothing dishevelled, and the stark winter landscape only deepened the sense of tragedy. She had been shot twice in the head and at close range. The act was clearly deliberate and merciless. The evidence suggested a brutal end to what should have been an ordinary night. Speculation spread like wildfire. People wondered if this was just a random act of violence, or if Regan had been targeted. We know, of course, that her phone and purse were missing, and this led some people to wonder if she'd been the victim of a robbery, but as I mentioned a moment ago, her jewellery was still in the car. Friends and family were adamant. Regan was cautious and she was street smart. She wouldn't have walked alone if she felt unsafe. And so that raised the question for them. Could someone she knew have lured her into danger? Witnesses had reported a suspicious vehicle near the park, but descriptions were vague and from one to the next they were contradictory, so it kind of just added to the confusion. As investigators sifted through the evidence, everyone just had to kind of wait. Friends flooded social media with posts pleading for information, and they even held candlelight vigils in memory of Regan and hoping to kind of gain some kind of information if anyone had seen anything or heard anything suspicious on that night. Regan's story gripped Columbus, a mystery that seemed to defy explanation, until the smallest details began to unravel the horrifying truth. The discovery of Regan's body marked the start of an intensive investigation that would uncover a grim and devastating series of events. On the night of February 8th, 2017, a 57-year-old man called Brian Goldsby had been prowling the streets of Columbus. This man, Brian, had a long history of violence. He was a registered sex offender and he'd recently been released on parole. Brian had spent much of his life in and out of prison, and his criminal record included robbery, assault, and sexual violence, crimes that painted a clear picture of a man incapable of rehabilitation. Despite this, Brian was released into the community with minimal oversight. But as part of his release agreement, he was given and made to wear this GPS ankle monitor. Now, although the device functioned as basically a tracker, it was very passive. This meant that he could go on and pretty much do whatever he wanted, go wherever he wanted, but the important thing was that he would be tracked. Investigators quickly managed to piece together the chilling timeline of events. As Regan walked to her car that evening, Brian approached her. He forced her into her vehicle at gunpoint and took control. It began a horrific series of events that would stretch across the next few hours. Evidence later showed that Brian drove Regan to several ATMs, coercing her into withdrawing cash while she just sat terrified in the passenger seat. Surveillance footage from these locations captured fleeting images of Regan, her expression one of fear and helplessness. Witnesses later reported seeing a silver Acura idling in the ATMs, but at the time, no one suspected the danger unfolding inside. When Regan's abandoned car was recovered, forensics became key to unravelling the crime. We spoke earlier about how there were certain pieces of evidence found in Regan's car, and one of those was that cigarette butt that had DNA on it. That DNA had been tested, and it was matched to Brian. Of course, his profile was already logged in the system for his prior offences, so that match came up quite quickly. It was the first solid lead in the case, but detectives, of course, needed more to try and understand the full scope of what had happened. Further examination of Brian's GPS ankle monitor revealed a damning trail. The device had recorded his movements throughout the night of February 8th, tracking him from the Short North District to the locations of the ATM withdrawals, and ultimately to that Metro Park where Regan's body was found. The data painted a vivid picture of Brian's predatory behaviour, each stop a breadcrumb leading investigators closer to the eventual truth. It became clear that this was not a crime of passion, but one of cold, calculated cruelty. To understand how Brian came to commit such an unthinkable act, detectives needed to delve into his past. He was born into a troubled environment. His childhood was marked by instability, by neglect, and by abuse. He spent much of his youth in and out of foster care, and during this time, he was exposed to violence and just generally a lack of structure, and this set the stage for his criminal path. By his teenage years, Brian had already begun committing petty crimes. This was a kind of precursor, I suppose, to the more violent offences that would define his adult life. Brian's criminal record revealed a disturbing escalation. In 2010, he was convicted of robbery and rape, a case that involved him ambushing a woman in her driveway. The brutality of the attack landed him in prison, where he served 6 years before being paroled. He was released in November 2016. This was just 3 months before Regan's murder. Of course, we know that Brian was required to wear this GPS monitor, but other than that, he was basically unsupervised. Despite his violent history, the system failed to ensure that he wouldn't harm again, a failure that, of course, now we know proved fatal. As evidence mounted against Brian, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Detectives, led by seasoned investigator Detective Rick Forney, painstakingly reconstructed the events of February 8th. The detective, a veteran with decades of experience in homicide cases, described this crime as one of the most senseless acts of violence he'd ever encountered. His team worked tirelessly to connect the dots, leveraging both forensic evidence and old-fashioned detective work. The GPS data from Brian's ankle monitor became the cornerstone of the case. It showed that after forcing Regan into her car, Brian drove aimlessly around the city. He stopped at those ATMs that were later confirmed by witnesses and CCTV footage, and he stopped at other locations where more surveillance cameras captured his image. This, combined with the DNA evidence from Regan's car, left little doubt about his involvement. When confronted with the evidence, Brian initially denied any connection to Regan. However, as the weight of the case became undeniable, he had no choice but to change his story. And in a chilling confession, he admitted to abducting Regan, but he claimed he hadn't intended to kill her. According to his account, after they arrived at this metro park, he ordered Regan to walk away from the car, insisting he had no intention of shooting her. He claimed that when she turned to look at him, he panicked and shot her twice in the head. Prosecutors, of course, strongly disputed this narrative during the trial. They presented evidence of deliberate planning and a history of violent offences. They argued that his actions demonstrated clear premeditation, the way he abducted Regan, the way he controlled her movements for hours, and ultimately executed her in a secluded area. All of this pointed to intentional, calculated violence. His statement was viewed as an attempt to downplay his culpability, but it was very clearly inconsistent with the evidence that was presented, and so he was not believed. Brian shot Regan twice in the head and left her body in the snow. Detectives uncovered further evidence that added to the horror. Brian had used Regan's debit card multiple times after her death, casually buying items at gas stations and convenience stores as if nothing had happened. And at the trial, they actually presented this surveillance footage from these various transactions, and it showed this man entirely devoid of remorse. His demeanour was calm and collected, even in the aftermath of such a heinous crime. He has literally just shot someone to death and he's walking around like nothing's happened. The investigation, of course, culminated in this trial, and prosecutors managed to paint a real accurate and harrowing picture of his actions. They argued that his crimes were premeditated, they pointed to his violent history and the deliberate steps he took to cover his tracks. After killing Regan, he drove her silver Acura to an apartment complex in that different part of Columbus and abandoned it there. He left the car locked in an attempt to delay its discovery and to distance himself from the crime scene. Now, on top of this, he discarded Regan's purse and phone in order to eliminate any trace of her personal identification. Those items were actually never recovered. He also discarded the gun that he used to kill Regan. Its location wasn't immediately revealed, and the absence of the weapon did really complicate things in the initial stages of the investigation. But of course, by the time we get to the trial, there's so much other evidence that actually didn't matter so much. It was also presented at trial that he had completely denied knowing or having any involvement with Regan, and he even tried to fabricate an alibi. He claimed complete ignorance of the crime. He claimed that he'd been nowhere near there, and of course it wasn't long before the police checked his alibi out and found out that he was lying, and this led to the next parts of the investigation. Brian was found guilty on all counts, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, rape, robbery, tampering with evidence, and theft. On the 21st of March 2018, Brian Goldsby was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Regan's family expressed relief at the conviction and sentence, but their grief remained immense. Her dad, Toby, stated in court that there was no punishment that could ever truly compensate for the loss of Regan. Because of this crime, the Reagan Tokes Act was passed in Ohio in 2019. It was a direct response to this tragic event. The new law introduces indefinite sentencing, allowing the state to hold offenders beyond their original sentence if they continue to pose a danger. It was designed to address concerns that dangerous prisoners might be released prematurely due to their minimum sentence expiring, even if they hadn't been fully rehabilitated. Now, despite this, of course, being passed and its intentions, the law has faced some legal challenges. Some prisoners, such as a man called Christopher Hacker and Danon Simmons Jr., argued that it violated constitutional principles, claiming it gave prison officials too much power to extend sentences without judicial oversight. Christopher Hacker was serving time for aggravated burglary, and Danon Simmons Jr. was convicted on drug and weapon charges. However, in 2023, the Ohio Supreme Court ultimately ruled in favour of the law, stating that the inmates had failed to prove that the law was unconstitutional in all cases. However, the court did acknowledge that individual cases could still be challenged if specific facts warranted it. For Regan's family and the Columbus community, the trial offered a measure of closure but also deepened the devastation, the reality of it all. In court, Lisa and Toby, Regan's mum and dad, listened as every horrific detail was laid bare, their grief obvious and devastating. Yet their determination for justice remained unshaken. They vowed to turn their tragedy into action, and that is when they started advocating for those systemic reforms that would hopefully prevent other families from experiencing such loss. Brian's life had been one defined by violence and failure. Failures of his upbringing, failures of the criminal justice system, and ultimately his failure to change. Regan's life, by contrast, was defined by love, potential and kindness, but that was stolen in a moment of unspeakable cruelty. The stark contrast between their lives added another layer of heartbreak to an already tragic story. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Red Rum. If you are wanting to sign up to the Red Rum newsletter, it's completely free. It will come into your inbox once a month. You can find a link to sign up to that in the description box down below. It includes all things Red Rum, including pictures from the cases, other little facts and tidbits of information that maybe didn't make the episode. Other than that, I'll see you next week, but have a lovely Christmas. Thank you so much for joining me this year. And yeah, I'll see you next week for another episode of Red Rum. Bye.